Hi, this is Molly Stevens, one of the hosts of Everything Cookbooks. Today's show is the last of our 5-part series during which we revisited past episodes devoted to recipe writing. In today's episode, Kate, Kristen, and I discuss the user experience aspect of recipe writing, and we get deep into the weeds about how to write recipes with clarity and dependability. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we will be back in April with a whole new lineup of host chats and guest interviews. Thanks for listening.
The ultimate user experience for a recipe is whether a cook can actually cook from it. But as we know, there's a lot that goes into making a recipe cookable. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and joining me today are Kristen Donnelly and Molly Stevens. Hey, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, Kate. A few weeks back, we talked about the design of books. Kristen led this great conversation, and we got really in the weeds about paper, spine, typeface, and how that all affects the UX, the user experience. So it's episode 91 if you want to listen to that first and then come back to this one. Today, we're talking a little bit on something different. We're going to continue the theme of user experience, but this time we're talking about the words on the page. So Molly and Kristen, I know we have a lot to talk about. We can go on for hours. We won't do that to you. But first up, let's just talk big picture. Big picture meaning table of contents, overall style, just themes of recipe names. I'll start with you, Molly. How can a book's organization impact the user experience? Loaded question.
Yeah. Oh, well, let me tell you, we think about a cookbook as, you use the term cookable at the top, which I love. And the idea, and I think we all have this in common, in that we write books that we hope, we want, we intend for people to take into their kitchens, to cook from, to recreate recipes that we have come up with. It's a user manual. It's something that's going to teach you how to do something. And so part of that, I think from the beginning, if it's just a pile of recipes, you need to organize them in some way, because if someone is going to your book and say it's a general, and everything, I think that we have to put the umbrella thing over this, is that who are you writing for is, we need to know that. Who is the user? But right. Regardless of who the user is, say it's a general book and there are chapters on soups and salads and appetizers, and it's in a sort of a standard organizational format. That format is there for a reason, because if someone is going to your book and they're looking for a soup, they need to go to the soup chapter. And do you have a table of contents that can help them find that? We talked about this in that earlier episode, where are the page numbers? So when they find where that tomato soup is, they can go to page 91 and find it. So organization, I just love that we're thinking about this way, because we think a lot about the organization, but why?
Right.
When I've taught a class about cookbook proposal writing, we spend a lot of time thinking about book organization. And you can delight people with the way you organize it and being really creative. But I also think sometimes if you almost don't want to have style over substance or form over function. In the end, I say it might feel boring, quote, to you to organize by type of dish. But in the end, that is how a lot of people look for recipes. That's how they cook. So don't knock it. Sometimes you can have fun with the titling of it if you really just don't want to say soup. But keeping that user in mind always when deciding on that organization is a good idea.
Right. And I think we can do, and we will do, an entire episode on book organization and different strategies and different styles that people have used successfully, whether it's by standard salad, soup, and whatnot, or if it's by season, or if it's by theme, or if it's by entertaining. We'll dive into that. But it's just something just top of mind. Think about that while we're talking a little bit more about the nitty gritty. But I want to go back to something, Molly, you said, who is your user? Mm-hmm. When you think of that, who are you thinking is the user for this book? What goes into figuring out who is the person who's going to be cooking from a specific book?
Do you ever have a specific person in mind? Sometimes I do. I'll have a specific person that I'm writing a recipe for. I feel like my sister-in-law, for example, is a really good example, because she is somebody who cooks a lot, but cooks a lot from recipes. She's somebody, I kind of almost know the amount of detail somebody like her needs. So sometimes when I'm writing a recipe, it is very specific, what does this person and then people like her need?
Right. It's such an important question, because We are going to get into the language of recipes in a minute, but how you're writing those recipes, what level cook are you writing for? And there's no right or wrong answer. And one of the things I think I'll come back to a lot today is consistency. Because if you write some of your recipes for a brand new cook who's never made anything, and then you write others that are much more advanced, I'm not saying you can't do that, but you need to come up with some sort of vehicle to do that, because you'll lose people unless you have like a beginner section, an intermediate section would be another way to do a book.
Right. And I think it goes back to something that we've joked about on the podcast on whether you can say fold in the ingredients or not, because people fold it in, and it goes back to that Schitt's Creek episode where they're looking at, making this dish and like, how do you fold cheese in? It's like not a sweater, So it's figuring out like, does your audience understand what it means to fold in the flour or not?
I think one of the trickiest things for cookbook authors, recipe developers, recipe writers is that in most cases, all cases, many cases, we're not our users.
Right.
So maybe there's some people who write books for people, just like themselves, but oftentimes we're writing for people. For me, I always think of it as a teaching vehicle. So I'm trying to teach people. And it's so hard. I mean, I go back to, that Bee Wilson episode, I think, is a really interesting. We talk about it a little bit in the episode. She talks about a lot in her book, The Secret of Cooking. There's one line where she says the reader and the writer are speaking slightly different languages because the writer knows where they're going to get to, what the outcome is. They know the recipe from in and out. And we've all had that experience where we've been with someone in the kitchen who's less experienced or hasn't made that dish before, and you're watching them cook it and they don't know where they're going.
Right.
And it's not their fault, but
right.
How do you help someone know where they're going when reading and cooking are different experiences?
Completely different experiences.
Yeah.
And the more you cook and the more you write recipes, the farther removed you get from what it was like to be a first-time recipe user,
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, is like recreating what that mindset was. I think a really good example of a book to look at if you're really targeting beginner cooks, but you also want to appeal to a range of types of readers, is the Simply Genius cookbook from Food 52. We had an episode on it, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But for example, my partner Patrick doesn't cook, but I gave him this book, and now he's like flagged recipes to try. And the other night he made pad thai from the book.
Oh, wow.
And then he's also made, pizza and gnocchi, and he's a recipe follower. He chops everything, so it's interesting watching that and then thinking of how that translates to like how you write a recipe that anybody can come to.
What's the structure that makes it easy for someone? And when you say first-time recipe follower, I think it's important. It's not someone who's never followed a recipe, but it's the first time they've followed that particular recipe.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
That's true. It can be both, but yes, the first time you've made a recipe. I think the book doesn't make assumptions about that you would know when, say, a piece of salmon was done. Instead, they kind of they document through photos, these are the different levels of doneness, and it's okay if you get to this point. And then the recipes aren't very cluttered. They have like clear numbered steps, and it's very clear on this is what you have to do ahead, and this is what you do after you have all the ingredients all ready to go to make your pad thai, for example. So it's something that was interesting. It's a good test to see if he could do it, because I think I gave other cookbooks and it was like a little too involved. And I think the visuals can really help. And we talked a lot about visuals in our previous sort of user experience episode, but that's just something to think about when you're writing recipes. Are you going to be incorporating these visual cues to help to guide readers? If you're writing for somebody who has a collection already of, say, every single America's Test Kitchen book, they're going to have a different sort of need or want in a recipe, right?
And how do you telescope that, though, in a book? How do you let the user, the buyer, know when they're picking up a book?
Oh, good question.
Yeah.
This book is too advanced for me. This book is too basic for me.
I love what you said a few episodes ago, Kate, about like, it's great when books tell you how to use them in a sense. I've been thinking about that a lot. And, it's like that front matter is such a good place. But I also think even in the sales copy to a certain point, like on the back of the book, I guess there's probably ways to say it, like for cooks who like a project or.
Right. For cooks who like a deep dive into, a new place, a new part of the world. Those could be cues of like, this might take a little bit of a more heavy lift, more study before you're flying with it.
Yeah. I've also noticed sometimes even on Amazon descriptions of books, sometimes there will be like, this book is for, and it'll like list out certain people with their interests. I'm sure it's like for search reasons. I feel like all of those places are good places to try to like match a book to a user and reader.
And another thing that can help readers sort of get a feel for what they're in for a book, I think, is, how recipes are titled and what's in a recipe head note. We have full episodes on those topics. Episode 28 is all about recipe head notes, and episode 42 is how to write recipe titles. Those are worth revisiting, but just in terms of like the user experience, I know recipe titles, that's a tricky one because, you know, there's times where important cultural elements can be lost by trying to make a recipe title so-called too user-friendly, and that's not good either.
Like if you're saying like bibimbap versus Korean rice bowl or something like that.
Yeah.
But you're also with the recipe title, it's a sales tool as well, right? You're trying to, if someone's flipping through a book, you want recipe titles to grab people that sound delicious, that sound appealing in some way. So you're trying to pack information in there. You're trying to make it sound appealing. It can be very tricky.
And getting that balance. And if it is, maybe it's a cuisine that's unfamiliar for, say, your audience, the people that you assume are going to be picking up this book, maybe it's that balance where there's enough sort of like gimmies that people can flip through like 20% of the recipes. They can understand what it is. Maybe it's the rest of them that take a little bit more reading of the head note that's going to explain things, but then you still have like enough where people can kind of feel like they can make progress without having to take hours of study before they start cooking from the book. Mm-hmm. So much to think about.
I know, it's funny. I think we're stumping ourselves here in a way. I mean, there's so much to think about, and I'm trying to stay focused on the user experience because what is the purpose of a recipe title or a recipe head note from a user's experience? And to me, I think of, I don't know if you already said this, but the table of contents is sort of the roadmap where this book will take you, what the chapters are, what you can expect from this book, whether it's seasonal or geographical or ingredient driven or whatever it is, or parts of a meal. And then the recipe titles are the place names. So then you've got your roadmap and then the place names are in there. So you're just trying to find if you think about each book as sort of a canvas or an experience. And I also think we're talking about the user and how you use this book. Do you find, and I know we don't cook from books as much as we probably work on them, but my experience I've learned from other people is they fall in love with the voice. They fall in love with the style of a book. And so say you love Nigella Lawson's books and you're just going to go to her recipes and her recipes are going to get easier and easier to follow because you know her voice.
Oh, good point.
So that's part of it. And I'm thinking now, we talked about, they had the great episode on criticism, but this notion of a Goodreads for cookbooks where you could follow people who are the same kinds of cooks as you. And that's not necessarily the level of cook, but the way you like to be in the kitchen. Are you lemon and rosemary and garlic, or are you, I don't know, come up with another set of ingredients. And Goodreads would tell you, what books, what authors would appeal to you, would hit you where you live kind of thing.
Oh, that's a really interesting idea. So big picture, there's a lot that goes into it. I love this analogy, though, of think of it as a roadmap. It's going to be a choose your own adventure roadmap. They can go to different chapters. They can bounce around, but you're going to give them that framework up front. Now let's actually get into the nitty gritty, because I think this is where people can really get tripped up when you're writing recipes, especially for the first time. Before ingredient list, we have our head note. Then we have, information on yields. But what about, say, equipment needs or planning tips before you start the recipe? Where does that go? What are your opinions, hot takes on that?
It also can depend on like the reader and the space, like magazines often don't include equipment. I have rarely done that, but it is useful, So if you're writing a book for a reader who doesn't necessarily want to scan the method for that info, but likes to see it above. I don't know. What do you think, Molly?
Just listing the general equipment for every recipe to me is just tedious and takes up a lot of space. But I do think special equipment can be helpful. You say, this is a recipe I really want to make. And then you realize that you need a ricer or you need a
dehydrator.
Yeah.
Right. You just bust out the dehydrator.
Yeah. I think in those cases, I often will in the head note maybe add like, you'll need a dehydrator.
Right. And then the head note, you referenced that before, but what purpose does the head note? And we're not going to talk too much about it, but is it there to tempt the person, the user, to make the recipe, or is it there to provide the information that what you're going to need to know, what would be helpful to know before you start the recipe?
Right.
Or both.
Right. When I was working on the Michael Mina book that comes out this fall, we decided to have a little equipment section. And I have to tell you, that was part of the challenge of copy editing and proofreading, was making sure we were consistent with certain parts of equipment. It's like, do you have to call for a blender? But if you call for a blender in that equipment section, every time you use a blender in any of the other recipes, you have to make sure that equipment is called out. I thought it was probably more important to call out when you need, say, metal skewers for grilling or like a certain type of griddle. But once you do put the blender or the food processor in that equipment list, you also have to do it consistently across the board. So if people are kind of wondering if they need an equipment section, just think about the back end part. You have to be consistent throughout.
Right. And yield, you mentioned yield, Kate.
Right.
And when you and I interviewed Lorado, there's a wonderful yield where she says something about serves 4 if you're hungry or serves 4 if you're...
It's like serves 4 or 2 piggy eaters, like my husband and me or something. I don't
Right. It was a really
remember.
sweet,
something like that.
I struggle a lot with yield sometimes when I'm writing books.
I do too, because I feel like it's like, what's ideal in terms of, I have like some experience with traditional nutrition, I guess. So I know like the ideal portion of certain meat is supposedly 4 to 6 ounces. Yeah. But like realistically, if you have like a bunch of eaters who are over 6 foot tall and, just like
or teenagers or
Right.
athletes
Yeah.
or, there's so many different people. And then pasta is one I still don't know.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I know.
Pasta.
Look at a box of pasta and it tells you how many servings are in a box of pasta. Not in my house. It's never enough.
For very dainty eaters, perhaps. Yeah.
Because it's based off of 2-ounce portions, which I think a lot of times in Italy, pasta is like part of not always, but it'll be like the pasta before a main course. And so it's like coursed out. But yeah, here it's very normal, I think, for people to eat like 4 ounces of pasta. Or even
And also we talk about the way people eat. There's so many more grazing dinners and things like that where the vegetable chapter, I ran into this in my last book, where a lot of those dishes I would turn into a dinner, a supper.
Right. Or it's like, how many dishes will you have if you're bringing something to a party? It's like, is it one of 4 dishes or one of 20?
I feel like all we're doing is we're just presenting things you have to figure out.
Or basically, it goes back to like the Sally Eckes episode we had ages ago when we'd ask Sally something and her answer was always, well, what my answer is going to be? It depends. And I feel like that was talking about agents and working with authors, working with agents. This is talking about writing recipes. And the answer is depends. And when you pick up your favorite books, you will see so many different approaches. So I think what we're trying to do in this episode is just give people that peek under the hood about all these decisions that have to be made. And that they've been thought through in a book that works. All these decisions have been thought over and sweated over. It's not something that just happened.
Right. And I'd like to say if somebody's working on a book and they're considering yields, don't phone it in because really think about it. And even if you don't know the answer to it, say serve 4 or 2 piggy eaters. Or you could use another words besides piggy. But there are ways to be honest about what you really think the yield is.
Absolutely. So maybe we have an equipment list, maybe not. We have a yield because we definitely need a yield, and especially baking recipes. If it's 12 cookies, we want to know. If it's 12 dozen cookies, we need to know. So definitely for baking, you have a little bit more.
So do you say makes 1 8-inch cake?
Oh.
Do you say how many servings, or do you just say makes one 8-inch cake?
That's where I
because you can sliver that thing to serve.
There you go. Yes, and in the head note, you could say it's a super rich cake and make
sliver it up,
slices.
Or for piggy eaters, make 2 of them. And you can serve a lot more. So we've got yield. We've thought about serving size a little bit. Room for interpretation, prep time, cook time. Is this important? I think users really like this. Cookbooks that have these seem to really cater toward, let's make this book something that people can envision themselves making on a weeknight when they don't have that much time. I find on the back end recipe development, when you're trying to figure out how long it takes to do a recipe, it's like, well, I don't know. It depends how fast people are at chopping onions. Like I can chop an onion pretty fast, but maybe not everyone can. So
I know I have a weird relationship with timing on recipes because the knife prep for me is 5 minutes.
Yeah. Right.
For my husband, it's 20 or whatever. Yeah. But when I worked in magazines, we always had time, and we often had not pressure, but there were sections where it's like, this has to be a 30-minute recipe. And so, we would call things 30-minute recipes that I think for like an average but somewhat experienced cook, it's true. But, I feel like sometimes if you put something as a 30-minute recipe and then it's taking somebody longer, that's frustrating. So sometimes I just don't even put them.
Yeah.
In cookbooks, I often don't put timing unless it is going to be one of those, like, this is a weeknight book. Yeah,
it's a huge question and a challenging one. And I feel like for a book, if you decide to do it, don't you have to do it across the board? Although one way around it, if you say you could call out the quick recipes, because really isn't that what people are looking for when they're looking for the times? So you could, if it's something that you want to highlight the fact that you actually have recipes, and I don't know that 30 minutes, I wouldn't call 30 minutes, if it's hands-on time, 30 minutes, that's a big chunk of your evening.
Well, that's
really.
a whole other, because sometimes people will say prep time, cook time, which I've never liked. I like active and total.
Yeah.
Because then you might say 15 minutes active and that's 2 hours total, but that might fit in just fine with what you have going on.
So you just have to do the active time and then get the thing in the oven or on the stove or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So it's a big one to figure out before you set off and say, I'm going to do this for every recipe in a book. What I did, I think, yes, I did this in the braising book and the roasting book, is I highlighted just the cooking time. Because with something like braising, where the times can be very long, I wanted to emphasize that they're not all I mean, I don't think there's any under 35 minutes, but there are some 40-minute, half hour, 1 hour, and then there's some 3 hour, 6 hour, 7 hours. So I thought that was important information. If you're setting off to make short ribs and it's, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you might not be having those for dinner. But you could be doing chicken thighs. And so it just says braising time. It doesn't say prep time or active time. It just literally braising time. And the same thing with the roasting book, and in that book, I was talking about the different techniques. And so it would say what style of roasting. So was it high heat, moderate heat, and then the time. It's just that seemed to work. But the prep time, everybody's prep time is different.
Right.
And, you ran out of rice. And so you got to go to the store and buy some more because that's really part of your prep time.
Right. And I think that's one of my hardest things when I've had to develop recipes that have that prep time component, because I'm not ever sure exactly how accurate it is what I end up delivering. It's sort of like, this could be an hour for somebody. And I also think it always just takes me longer to do a recipe the first time, even if it is a quick recipe. So if it's somebody else's recipe and I've never made it before and I'm following the recipe, it might take me 45 minutes just because I'm having to go back and read it. So, all those little things. But Molly, I like what you're saying about anything that takes longer. It's that giving that little, maybe the prep time isn't that important to the user. It's really figuring out, okay, I can't do this in any time under 3 hours because it needs to braise for at least that long. And thinking if anyone's working on fermentation, something that's going to take a couple of weeks, that's something that's very handy to know up front. And if you happen to have a bunch of recipes in your book that all take longer, maybe they fit in the same chapter. And maybe if you have a bunch of short, quick recipes, they could be in their own chapter. So you don't have to necessarily have that prep time, cook time. I love active time, though, active and total. That makes a lot of sense, too, if you have to have those timestamps. But I do see more books having that. So I feel like that's something that more cookbook authors are going to be grappling with. Let's go into the ingredient list, though, because we've had episodes already where we talk about how hard it is to talk about onions. And the reason is, do you call for 1 yellow onion chopped? Do you call for 2 cups chopped yellow onion, finely chopped? What is chopped? What is diced? What is any of this minced? Ingredient lists, like just general practices. What are sort of like the key fundamentals in a good ingredient list?
Well, you list them in the order in which you use them, and that is for the user's experience. So when you're going through the recipe, you sort of keep track of everything. I feel like there's more of a trend to take the prep out. I feel like when I started out, you could put as much prep as you wanted into the ingredient lists and people would just sort of roll with it. Like the beans, dried beans could be soaked overnight and rinsed. And that's just tucked in the ingredient list. Like, oh, guess you're not having that for dinner tonight. You didn't know that. And, and I feel like that's coming out of the ingredient list a little bit more. There aren't these hidden prep tasks tucked in there as much.
Often, like anything that involves knife work, I go back and forth with like 1 onion chopped, as long as it's, I guess you're like cooking it. And I don't know. I guess if there's not going to be huge discrepancy between like the size of the chop and the outcome of your dish, I'll go with 1 onion chop sometimes. But then let's say you're cutting up fennel, which is a little less familiar for some people. Like sometimes I'll not put that prep in the ingredient list and I'll go through the like actually how to break it down. Mm-hmm. It's tricky though. There have been times I'm not consistent with things in that way. I play around with it.
I mean, I talk about consistency a lot and I feel like I bang that drum a little too
I think consistency within a book makes sense to me, right. Like coming up with those things. But I guess I mean like in my whole recipe development life.
Yeah.
Right.
Sometimes I like decide actually, I like doing it this way now. So.
But also think about, like, if we think about how we cook, and I'll go into the kitchen and, I have an idea where I'm headed, and I'll start something and then I'll go chop the onion. So I haven't gone. The ingredient list with all the prep put in there is assuming you're doing all your mise en place before you're cooking. And that's a very organized way to cook. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. But there's also, and again, I think that we're seeing more of this. I mean, Ali Slagle's book was taking us this way, that whole meanwhile when we're cooking, right? You know what I mean by the whole meanwhile? Like, do this and then get this going. So the active time is spread out while something you can get something cooking and then work on something else and get something else, so it all comes together.
I'd have to look at old Rachel Ray recipes. I feel like that's the way she on TV would definitely be cooking, was a lot of times the way we do, you start something and then you're doing your knife work and you just like dump it right in, and then you like kind of stir while you do maybe chop up something else. In a written format, it can feel chaotic almost.
Absolutely.
It can. Sometimes it depends also, like Kristen, you were saying, does the reader know how to handle fennel? Maybe 30%, maybe 50% of the readers do, but for that other percent, it makes sense to kind of spell it out. I think one of the things that brought to mind, I believe it's a curry, one of the curries in the Burma Superstar book. In a lot of these recipes, you used minced yellow onion and sliced yellow onion. So in that case, it just seems silly to have like 1 cup minced yellow onion and then 1 cup sliced yellow onion. So I just put the onion prep in the method. So it was like cut an onion in half, dice half of it, slice half, save that slice for later, because then it's not like trying to figure out in the ingredient list just seemed fussy and made the recipe seem harder, I think.
Yeah. Citrus is one I struggle with. And this just happened to me in an article I turned in for a magazine, and the editor came back and she's like, explain to me what you're doing. I don't understand. And it's because too often we want the juice before we use the zest. So when you're writing the recipe from a user standpoint, I want to make sure you've zested it, even if you put the zest aside to use later, before you juice it, because we've all tried to zest a juiced citrus. It's not fun.
Yep.
So in the ingredient list, you call for, and in this particular recipe, I use half the orange for juicing, half the orange for slicing, and the zest for something else. So I just called for 1 orange. Then I had to write this whole method: zest, put aside a teaspoon, take half of it. It's a lot of words for just a bunch of slices and juice and zest.
Something that's easy to do in the kitchen, hard to get on the page.
Right.
Yeah. Citrus is a tricky one. I always have to go back and forth. It's like, but they need to zest it and then they need to juice it. And it's like, where does that go in?
So you're trying to create an ingredient list that tells people what they need to have on hand.
Right.
And then if there's any advanced prep, and save space on the page. Like, rather than get into the method and say, chop your onion. I mean, who does that, right?
Right.
Crack your eggs.
Right.
Could you imagine?
Open the drawer and get out a spoon.
Right.
Yeah.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of Everything Cookbooks, but it does take resources to make it happen. We'd like to invite you, our loyal listeners, to help us keep the lights on. To support the show, go to everythingcookbooks.com/support. There you can find links for any upcoming insider events where we go even further behind the scenes of the cookbook publishing world. You can also leave us a review, order books through our affiliate page, check out our awesome merch like t-shirts, sweatshirts, or you can even just buy us a round of coffee. Every little bit helps keep the show going. Thanks for listening. This can open up a Pandora's box, but volume, weights, metric, yada, yada. Hot takes on that.
There's so many more people becoming like recipe developers specifically who are, they call themselves team scale and especially with baking, but overall in general. And I understand that. But I also know a lot of publishers, like, they still want those cup measurements even in baking, at least for us here in the US, where we are scale resistant for whatever reason. I thought it was interesting in Michelle Braxton's episode, we talked a little bit how she actually polled her audience, which I think actually is a great thing to do.
Yeah.
I mean, she would poll people like, what's helpful for you for how I call for something? And she learned, for example, with vegetables, it's helpful to say like 1 head romaine, so people know what to shop for, and then 2 cups chopped, so they know the prep.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point, because how people shop for the ingredients is also part of the user experience. If they have to sort of do mental gymnastics to figure out how much of an ingredient they need to buy in the produce section, it's a little complicated. But if they know that they're shopping for a bunch of cilantro, a head of romaine, a bunch of kale, that can be a good benchmark. So it's easy to make their grocery list because you want your cookbook to be something that people can easily scan and put in their grocery list or use on an app and get to the store and get excited to cook, because that's something that I think we don't spend enough time thinking about. And I think this is something that in The Secret of Cooking, Bea spends a lot of time talking about. It's not just the time you spend prepping the vegetables in the kitchen. It's also going to the store. It's sourcing it. It's bringing it home. It's washing it, all that stuff.
For me, that's every week. It's like, I got to think about this again.
Right. But that bunch of kale, one bunch of kale, and then later I'm going to say,
Yes.
if it matters, how many cups.
Yes.
But would it be helpful, like when I look at the kale, there's a lot of different sizes of bunches of kale. So it's one bunch of kale, about 1 pound or whatever you come up with.
I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, I do too.
I like adding that. I think Michelle ultimately decided not to. I can't remember. I'll have to look. But I think she largely went away from weights and was like, they'll chop off what they need and then they can use the rest if they have an extra big bunch for something else.
Right.
And speaking of use the rest and user experience, I love books that consider that. They've asked me to get something and now I have a lot of it left over, and whether it's that bunch of kale or that head of fennel that I only needed half of or something. And I love a little note that'll say, use it here. Or I have a rule that I use in many books where I don't want to say never, but very rarely is there a one-time ingredient called for. Mm-hmm. If I'm using something, it'll have a couple uses.
It's also nice when something can just be used up.
Yes.
You can't do that for everything, but
right.
You sometimes see this in chef cookbooks that have been converted from grams into volume, and it'll be like, 3.5 eggs or something. And you're like, no, people aren't, like that's something that clearly wasn't quite thought out. Like it makes the recipe feel a little half baked, even though you know that the actual recipe is probably great, but they're making it in much bigger quantities. That's another thing to look at. I really want to get into method because I know we've touched on it, but first, what about sublists? Sometimes you have a sauce that goes with the roast or things like that. How do you like those on the page?
As a cook, I know my ideal is to never go to a sub recipe ever, but also it's just not the way it works. And sometimes it's fine. I'm like, my rule is this, except when it's not.
It depends.
It depends.
Yeah, I was going to say my rule is, a sub recipe should always be used more than once in a book, but I'm trying to think if that's always true. But I do, when I can, like to just incorporate a sub recipe actually into the recipe, I will do that.
So say it's a chocolate cake that has a caramel frosting. Are you thinking that's the sub recipe, or is that?
Well, that could be a sub recipe, and it could live. It depends also on the name of the recipe. If the recipe is maybe called chocolate cake with caramel frosting, maybe that frosting recipe lives within the main recipe.
Right.
It's just there's a space with the cake ingredients, and then there's a little line that says frosting, and then the frosting ingredients. So that's another way it can live in the same sort of footprint. You don't have to turn on a bunch of pages, hopefully. But in that case, maybe it's just separated by a line. Maybe there's a little subhead that separates the cake ingredients from the frosting ingredients.
Or like pickled onions on a taco.
Pickled onions on a taco, yeah.
Like, because I can see arguments for that either way, where you make a quick pickle and that's just incorporated in your recipe. But then if you're going to use it over and over again, I guess maybe it goes into a pantry section of sub recipes.
The pantry section, which we didn't get into, but we will get into in a future episode.
Yeah. But I think the impulse is, and I know we want to wrap up the ingredients, but I think the impulse is to keep the ingredient lists concise from a user standpoint. Like not too much information in there, not too many sub recipes, not having to go to other parts of the book to make this thing. I think we're trying to get it as bare bones as possible without taking away from the recipe.
Yeah.
I think that goes back to what we talked about in the design episode, the design of cookbooks, because we want things that are pleasing to the eye that we can also read easily. And it's been tricky when the font has to be very small to squish all the ingredients on the page. Right. This ingredient list was a little too long, but we want to really fit it in the page. That makes it a little harder to cook from. And more intimidating.
And I think early on, Kate, you said something, you used the analogy, equipment manual. So you buy something that you have to put together and you get out the big piece of paper and you're sitting and you're trying to build the whatever it is, the bookshelf. And then you get all the way done and there's 3 screws left.
Oh, yeah.
So same thing with the recipe, when you get all the way done and like
You're like,
where'd that
yeah.
6-ounce cup of yogurt go? I never put it in the recipe.
Like the Aleppo pepper did not make it on the plate, you know? But yeah, that's definitely something. I think in the Andy Baragani episode, when Andrea and I talked with him, he had a really good tip, which is if the method is long, have a short ingredient list. If the ingredient list is long, have a short method. And it's a trick of the eye.
I love it. I actually love that. I
It's
forgot
really
about that.
clever. And I think about that all the time, especially when I'm working with chefs. I said, we can do this recipe. However, we need to find a way to make the ingredient list short if we're going to have this long method, and vice versa.
It's brilliant.
Really smart.
It's
really
brilliant.
smart. So on that segue, see what I did there?
Yeah. That's why you host it. That's why you host.
We're going to talk about method. There's a lot here that can go wrong. I know for me, my first draft, oftentimes I can have a lot of extra words. Extra words aren't necessarily a good thing for somebody who's trying to cook, as they're reading. But what are sort of tricks of the trade when it comes to writing a good method?
I mean, there's like your basic rules, right? Rules, quote, we're always trying to include some kind of sensory test, whether that's visual or it could be sound, it could be smells, potentially even taste, as well as an approximate time, because there's just so many variables in different kitchens. So you want people to like feel pretty confident what they're looking for before they move on to the next step. So that's just like, I feel like a 101 thing that I do see a lot of maybe beginner recipe writers skipping sometimes on one or the other.
And I understand why people leave out the time sometimes, because the time is so variable, but then I want that variable. I want to know, even if it's 30 to 45 or 3 to 7.
You want to know when to start checking, right?
Yes. You need to use action verbs. You need to keep it. You're telling people what to do. So I think easy place to get hung up is on the vessel.
Yes, let's talk about that.
I think there's a lot of them. We've joked about this, but in a bowl, whisk together the eggs and milk. Do I have to say in a bowl? I don't know. It depends. Do you need a specific bowl, or does it not really matter? Are you just whisking them together to then add them to something else? So I think you're trying to get to the essential information to be helpful because the more words are on the page, the more they're looking at the page and not at what's happening in the kitchen. And the longer it's going to take them to go back and reference where they were. So it's a really tricky balance.
I remember like at Food and Wine, we used to always say enameled cast iron casserole. But I feel like more people now might know Dutch oven. So sometimes even just like the names for various vessels and like when to use pot versus saucepan, skillet versus frying pan, all those little decisions.
All those little decisions. And also, is it a large skillet or is it a 12-inch skillet? I think Andrea in her books has had like the chart where it's like 12-inch large, like that. So she doesn't have to keep saying 12-inch skillet. Because then if you're also incorporating metrics because you have gram measurements, do you also have to have not just 12-inch, but then you have to have the centimeter? And then you have to do that consistently for anything you are measuring, which can add a lot of words to the page.
Right.
But also can be useful depending. If your book is coming out and you want a global audience, you kind of need those centimeters in there. That's something to think about, like who is your user?
Well, and I think team scale, a lot more people are using metric.
Agree. Yeah.
Agree.
In the U.S. too. And that whole, I mentioned the word meanwhile before, but meanwhile in the procedure, giving people an idea of once something, what to do while something, because often we're cooking things in many stages. And how do you balance that? How do you bring them along?
There was like a cartoon about meanwhile, because it was like, meanwhile,
Kill and pluck the chicken or something like that.
Sauteing for 5 minutes. And then
Right,
like, meanwhile,
right.
Kill and pluck the chicken.
So you have to be tricky. You have to be careful with meanwhile.
I've gotten more careful with meanwhile. I will say something you do a lot, Molly, and when I was doing my recipe newsletter, I was trying to put more subheads, because the nature of recipes, it's like an instruction manual, as you say, like you're doing, you're reading, you're doing, you're reading. So just to help people find exactly where they were. And I've become a fan. I like the subheads.
Yep,
when
me too.
possible.
Yeah. And the subheads for me, because of the way I write, I tend to put a lot of information in my recipes, which, some people like and some people don't. And so if you're a person who likes a lot of extra information, I tend to pack it in there. But if you've made the thing 5 times, you might not need.
All the instructions. So the subheads are basically the recipe for them.
Right. And the fennel is a great example. I do that with the fennel. I explain how to break it down, how to chop it up. And so the subhead would just say, chop the fennel. So the third time through, you don't have to read the whole description to figure out what's happening in that paragraph. It's just the subhead is there. So it works for the style.
I have a question about subheads. So you have your method. You can break that method into subheads because you have this one section that might be the main thing. And then there's going to be something else you're making, maybe a little sauce or a little dipping sauce or something. You could have a different subhead for that. What about numbers? Is everything numbered? Do you have separate 1 through 5 for each subhead? Or do you have the numbers, if you're numbering, which is another question, going all the way through to the end?
I like numbering, and I number all the way through from
sense.
start to finish.
I have mixed feelings about numbering because I like short paragraphs anymore because I feel like it makes it easy to scan. And so I guess you could have a numbered step that has multiple paragraphs, right? But is that weird? So
Sure. No, I think you can.
okay, because I was going to say, I feel like before with magazines, we always try to keep each numbered step to a paragraph, I think.
And magazines, the paragraph would be even smaller because there'd be small columns. So it wouldn't kind of be as large as it would be in a cookbook.
In any case, I've come to like short paragraphs, whether or not they're numbered.
I agree with that. And I think numbers are less popular than they used to be. I may be wrong there, but I feel like I see less of them. I like them because they're wayfinding devices for me. If I lose my place, I might remember I was on step 3. Step 3 might be 3 short paragraphs, but it's still that whole step is where I am browning the short ribs before they go into the enameled cast iron.
I wonder if it's more of a visual choice to not number steps, like if that's why the trend is such. Because I feel like some publishing book, like their house style is no numbers. So.
It's cleaner without them. The page is prettier.
Numbers make it more of that manual, but I do like numbers as a user.
I've seen bullets instead of numbers.
I guess that you don't have the like I'm in step 3 situation.
Right.
Yeah. Well, what about what happens when you say have a chapter in a book where there's a lot of similar recipes, or not similar, but they might all have a similar technique. Say toasty nuts, or think of it, maybe it's more of like a dough. Say if you're making dumplings and you might have variations on the dumpling dough that's slightly different, but there's a step that's repeated and throughout. Or when I was writing Cookie Love with Mindy Siegel, I ran into this with drop cookies. There's only so many ways to say, you're creaming the sugar and the butter. And we wanted to be consistent throughout all those drop cookie recipes where it was the same process. What do? Do you just repeat it over and over again? Do you say, just reference the first part of the book where we talk about all these different techniques? What's the most elegant way?
I think if it can stand alone, truly, like a dumpling dough, I think it's fine if that's like its own recipe that lives separately. And you're like, even if it's like you just get to the point of making the dough and then the actual recipe you're making talks about shaping or rolling or whatever, that to me feels fine. I feel like I would be frustrated if I was going to make a cookie and it's like, follow the method for creaming butter on page X.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that my approach to it is I would repeat it. But knowing me, there's more I'm going to want to say about it. So if it's creaming the butter and sugar, if we're doing the cookies, I may have, and I don't know, was it Dory? I'm trying to think who we spoke to about this, but I would probably have some front matter that would explain what the best temperature would be, what that the sugar should be lump free if it's brown sugar. I mean, would give more information there. That kind of information I wouldn't pack into every recipe, but I would give enough that someone could get through it without having to go to the reference material.
That makes sense.
That makes sense. Because a lot of times people are dipping in and out of recipes. They're not reading a cookbook cover to cover. I usually never do. So I think that's true. Is like giving them enough. But there can be, hardworking front matter that gives people more details, more guidance on these repeated techniques.
Yeah. Like when I wrote that braising book, not every braise, but a lot of the braises start by browning if it's a meat or poultry. And so I would explain how to brown it, how long it takes, what to look for. Very abbreviated. But then the front matter was what's happening? Why are you browning? Tips for better browning, things like that. So there is a way to put that. But then you mentioned this before, Kate, are you cross-referencing? Are you putting a little parentheses that says for more, see pages 10 through 12? I don't know that I would.
For your books, I don't think it made sense to, because it's sort of like it's if it's a roasting book, the beginning part is going to be about sort of best practices. And then the individual recipes, you're kind of thinking like people are already with you on this journey. So you don't have to keep saying, oh, so you didn't see page, 23 where I talked about this in depth. I don't think you need that for every recipe.
And I think the same is true for like those cookies. You just, if you want more tips and information in there, one of my favorite bits of front matter was in, I think it's that Brooks Headley, Fancy Desserts. And he says, things you need, things you may not recognize, and things I want to explain.
That's so good. That is really clever.
Because that's, you're not going to put that stuff in the recipe, but it's there if you want more information, if the user wants.
That's very smart. So in other words, just like with ingredients method, it depends. But, these are all the kinds of things that go through our heads. And this is the stuff we notice in cookbooks that we love.
Something I guess we've probably touched on it, but just like voiciness in general in a method. And to me, there's no fast rule. It's another decision. Because sometimes people have this very chatty style, especially like if they're used to blogging, very chatty style of recipe writing that sometimes can be hard to follow, depending if there's a lot of asides. So just something to keep in mind, like as you're developing your voice as a recipe writer, is it still in the end something that somebody can follow?
That's a really good point, Kristen, about how voicey you can get in methods. And I think none of us want happy robot voice, but we also want recipes that are succinct. And so I don't know, it's almost like props in a movie. I heard this on a podcast all about screenwriting. Characters were smoking, and then they were smoking in another scene, and then they were smoking in another scene. It was like, we get it. People were smoking in this era wherein this movie was made. If we just had one scene like that, it did a lot of heavy lifting, and more than that, it got distracting. So I guess, keep your smoking to a minimum in your method is kind of how I would look at it.
Yeah, there's ways to be voicey or to insert yourself or to communicate your own style without distracting.
It's the same like if somebody has a blog, if they're going to swear or anything, like one swear word can go a long way. Or some people might turn down the book. That's a different subject. But like these little words that like really stand out that people remember, they carry more weight than other words. Anything else on method that we should touch on?
I would say when you're writing your sample recipes for your proposal or at whatever stage, really focus on a couple different style or different types of recipes. And again, I'm going to talk about consistency, but make those decisions early on if you can, because even though you're thinking that the style decisions are about, are you saying a branch of celery or a rib of celery, which is a decision you need to make. I think it's okay to be inconsistent in that you might use different language, but you want a sense of the same amount of information, the same level of information in your different recipes. And so just try to make the decisions early on. Otherwise, editing is going to be, it's hard enough already without having to change your style midstream.
Absolutely. And then also maybe, if you're just getting started writing recipes, start with the simpler ones and build up those muscles, because it'll make it easier when you'll find your groove. And then when you have to tackle the longer recipes or the more complicated ones, you'll be more ready for that.
And think of your recipe testers as your beta users.
Absolutely.
Right? So that's more reason to give them the fully written recipes when they're testing it. And you're asking them not only to test for, correctness in the recipe and deliciousness, but what was their experience? Maybe I'm going to add that to my recipe tester worksheet now. What was your user experience with this recipe?
Before we wrap up, I wanted to talk a little bit about those little tips, those sidebars, those bursts, those things that maybe we didn't put in the head note or the ingredient list or the method, but we want to call attention to. We're seeing that in more books. There's good reasons to do it. There's also times where it could be distracting. What are just general rules of thumb when you're thinking about why do I need this little burst of information in the margin next to a recipe?
What you said, you're remembering Andy Baragani about the short ingredient list, long method. For me, the head note, if the head notes are getting way too long, a sidebar or a burst or a box is a way to, because not everybody wants a long head note. So I think of them that way. Is there something in there that is, first thing is try to get the head note down to just, something really concise, nice paragraph or two or 3 sentences or whatever your style is. But if there's something that came out of there that it was distracting from the head note, but you really want to share that information, to me, that is that's a sidebar.
Yeah. Plus there's always things like making something ahead, a note about sourcing an ingredient. Depending on the style, those can go at the end of the recipe, but they're also nice if there's a design element around them.
Right. And maybe they're in a different color. Maybe the typeface is different color from the recipe. So when you're reading the recipe, your eye's not jumping to it as you're following. That can be something that I've seen some books do. Or there's a box around it.
We kind of talked about this with, coding recipes as fast, but there's so many ways to code recipes, like for various dietary restrictions. Like maybe your entire book is not gluten-free, but that, the people that you're writing for will sometimes want a gluten-free recipe. Like, coding them that way can be very helpful.
Absolutely. I think we're going to have another one of these episodes, but I really want to delve next time into the front matter. All those things, that table of contents, how you set yourself up for success. I think there's still so much we can talk about recipe writing and methods, and a lot of that can go into how you develop and test recipes. But I think for now, we've given everyone enough to think about in terms of like how we go through this.
Here.
A lot to chew over, I think. Before we wrap up, though, any last guiding words of wisdom for people who are trying to make their recipes really shine and make them user-friendly?
I think studying other people's recipes, to be honest, like especially from sources where that they always work or that there's like a rigorous testing program, like and looking at a variety to try to like figure out what you like about whether it's like the house style or somebody's personal style. But that's what I would say. Spend time reading recipes in a very conscious way.
Do it with a notebook with you so you can write down the ideas as you see them.
Like spend time with Molly's book. Like, yes. And Andrea, actually, she has such a distinctive way of writing recipes. But then also like New York Times Cooking and those places where a lot of major media, they seem to emphasize brevity a little bit more.
Right. And I'd love the idea of having someone cook alongside you, whether they're following your recipe or someone else's, but cook with people, watch people, find a way to observe that's not overbearing. But you learn so much by watching other people cook. Like I said, whether it's your recipe or a recipe that's new to them, because they stumble upon things that you might not have stumbled upon.
Absolutely.
Find that sister-in-law, find that person you think you're writing for or you are writing for, and see if you can observe them cook. Just sort of sit in the corner with a glass of wine and take notes.
And then, fold in what you learn into your recipes. Okay, that's enough from me. I'm done. I'm done. I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you, Molly and Kristen. This was a great chat. I always come away thinking through how to improve my own recipe writing. So I thank you for this conversation.
Same. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. This show is available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. Any book mentioned on the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks, as always, to our editor, Abby Cirquitella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.